We come tonight to a section entitled The Valley of the Shadow of Death, and it follows on the heels of a chapter which you remember was entitled Christian Fights Apollyon. We spent 2 Wednesday nights looking at that as Christian traveled through the Valley of Humiliation and had to deal with a demonic force that came against him by the name of Apollyon. And so we come to another of these valleys that Bunyan wants to put before us. Now, before we get into the actual text itself, I want to draw your attention to something. There was a commentator on Pilgrim's Progress that noted this. I don't even remember when I read it. It's been some time. But I want to point it out and use it as a way of trying to understand what Bunyan's talking about here. There was a movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to develop a new form of hymnody in which the hymns were designed to appeal more and more to the emotions of people rather than to their minds. There was a very clear movement of that. You can see it very strongly in the early 20th century. Fanny Crosby is in the midst of that movement. As you know, she wrote more than 8,000 hymns over the course of her life, and she is perceived by many, not just me, but by many, as being a part of this hymnody of moving the framework of the hymns more and more towards the emotional and away from the theologically rich or doctrinally rich sense of the hymnody that came about after the Reformation. So this was a very clear movement. I'll give you one example of it. And I give this example just so that you'll understand what I'm talking about in terms of this hymnody. It comes from a hymn written by C. Austin Miles in 1912, which is at the height of this hymnody change, if you will. And it's a hymn called In the Garden. Probably, if you grew up in a fundamentalist Baptist church, you've probably heard this song, maybe even sang it at some point in the past. The lyrics go like this. I come to the garden alone while the dew is still on the roses, and the voice I hear falling on my ear, the Son of God discloses. And he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own, and the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. So you will notice that it's a hymn that's really painting this picture of life being about coming to this place and coming here and meeting with Jesus and tarrying with him there and having more of a intimate connection with him. There's interesting that as the song proceeds, there's really no mention of the scriptures in there. There's no mention of meeting with Jesus through the word. It's just tarrying with him in the garden in this sense. Now, I'm not saying the song is particularly evil in any way. It's just an example of this kind of change that was taking place in the early 20th century. And if you've paid attention at all during the course of the latter half of the 20th century, you know that kind of idea filtered its way and continued to filter its way through the hymnody all the way through the 20th century. You see it very strongly in what was called the contemporary Christian music scene, and now it's still pervasive in this new wave of Christian music. I'm not exactly sure what to call it. Is it contemporary, or is it, something in the 2020s or whatever? I don't know. I don't have a name for it, okay? But it's still much there, where if you listen to the lyrics, the lyrics very often are focused back on us. There's a lot of personal pronouns of I or me or my sort of thing in the verbiage of the song about my life and about how happy I am about things. And you can see how this hymnody change parallels the theological change that occurred in the 20th century at the same time. In fact, I would make a pretty good argument that this hymnody flowed out of the liberal theology that began rising in the late 19th century and began to peak in the early 20th century and infiltrated particularly the mainline churches, but now it's pretty much everywhere in evangelicalism. And it's the idea of the gospel now being more about our life in this world than about the kingdom of Christ and the need for reconciliation to a holy God. The social gospel out of the early 20th century is the obvious example of that, where the gospel became about meeting people's emotional and physical needs rather than about meeting their spiritual needs for righteousness and holiness in the face of a holy and righteous God, okay? And that continues, as you know, you walk into many churches today, and the primary theme of the worship is the happiness of the people that are there. People go there to get their weekly dose of some sort of therapy or some sort of, whatever you want to call it, to make them feel better about themselves. In other words, as I've said many times, I think if you were to distill down much of the singing and preaching of modern evangelicalism, it's really more about the pursuit of happiness than about the pursuit of holiness. And it's pervasive. And it really starts, in many ways, in this time. In fact, one of the side effects of that was that fundamentalism, which rose up to push back against the social gospel, wound up itself imbibing in much of the world of that, much of that kind of world, to the point where by the time you get to the latter part of the 20th century, fundamentalism was really being accused of being a very anti-intellectual movement. That it really wasn't about what you know, but rather about what you feel. Even fundamentalism was in that category, as they attempted to push back against the social gospel. So there was a strong push to that. And I think that, I don't think that it's arguable that the church faces this sense in which what the average Christian thinks about the Christian life is really this sort of sense of happiness and the desire for the good life. Or as Joel Osteen puts it, being one of the greatest purveyors of this kind of thing, is that you can have your best life now, right? Okay. Now, why do I say all that? Okay. Nice history lesson, but so what, right? Well, it fits with what this chapter is about, because what Bunyan is going to do here is he's going to explore the reality that most of us already know, which is the Christian life is not a dew-covered garden filled with roses. That it's something else. And very often it is far darker and far more troubling and far more difficult than we really let on. He's going to give us a picture here of a part of the Christian experience, which we have a tendency not to talk about because it's dark and gloomy. We don't want to talk about it. But Bunyan is going to put it before us and say, this is the reality of the Christian experience. Just as it is true that the Christian has to go out from the church armored with what is necessary to defeat the forces of evil and face them, it is also true that the Christian is going to have to go out from the church and deal with darkness and difficulties and a time in the desert. And you'll notice that Bunyan does this by painting another picture, a picture of another valley. And he calls it the valley of the shadow of death. So he's painted already one valley of humiliation, a place where Christian has to go and face down the reality of evil in this place. But now Bunyan says, let me tell you about another place that Christians have to go through as a part of what it means to live in this world. And I lost my thought there, but okay. So, the valley of the shadow of death is, he says, now at the end of this valley, at the end of the valley of humiliation, was another called the Valley of the Shadow of Death. Now, I have you to notice at the end of the previous section, after Christian fights Apollyon, you remember that at the end he had a brief mountaintop experience, if you will. Right? At the end of it, we see him there. Someone comes and brings him leaves of the tree of life, and he applies them to the wounds, and they heal. And then he sat down to eat some bread and drink of the bottle that was given to him a little before, and he was refreshed. So there's a sense in which even after that valley is over, he has a time, if you will, of being lifted up, but now it's back into the next. Because as you know, if you know anything about mountain ranges, you know that, once you come down from a mountain, you have to go into the valley before you can go to the next mountain and then into the valley again. Okay, so he's painting this picture of another valley. In this case, he uses a terminology that comes right out of Scripture, of course, which we'll get to more in a second. So at the end of this valley, there was another, and it was called the Valley of the Shadow of Death, and Christian must needs go through it. He has to go through this valley, because the way to the celestial city lay through the midst of it. That's Bunyan's way of saying the Christian of every stripe is going to face these realities. This is going to be life for the Christian. This is where we're going to have to go. We're all going to experience these places. All right. Now, you'll notice I haven't described it yet. We'll get there in a second. We're just putting before you the fact that Bunyan's painting a picture of us having to go through a place like this. Okay, so now he begins to describe it. He says, now this valley is a very solitary place. Now, I think what Bunyan means by that is that this is a place that you travel alone. This is a place you travel alone. Now, that leads us to have to deal with the question, okay, what is this valley that we're talking about? What is it that's being referred to here? You'll notice it's the valley of the shadow of death. It's not the valley of death. Okay, I'd have you to notice that. And even that's true, right, in Psalm 23, where this term comes from. It's the valley of the shadow of death. And the idea that's painted in the idea of a shadow is something that represents something else but is not the thing. All right, so if a tree casts a shadow, you look at the shadow and you go, well, that's a tree. Well, the shadow's not the tree. The tree's cast in the shadow. The shadow is a reflection of the tree itself. It represents the tree. You can look at the shadow on the ground and you can assume, oh, okay, it looks like a tree. Or if you see something else with a shadow cast, you can identify what the object is by virtue of the shadow that it casts. And so in this case, that's the idea. The shadow is the shadow of the substance, and the substance is death. So the shadow of death then would be those things that are not death themselves, but those things that are likened unto death. Or they're the results of a world in which death dominates. Because that's the world we live in. Death dominates. Death wins, right? All of us are going to face that moment when we die. And so death is going to win. Someone once, a great philosopher once says, you don't get out of this life alive, right? Everybody's going to die. Okay, so death permeates this creation. You think about what happened in the garden when Adam sinned. God came to him and cursed him and said, guess what, Adam? The ground is going to win. It's going to take you back. You're going to go back to the dust from which you came. And the whole creation is going to be affected by this reality. You're going to fight the soil in order to grow your crops, but it's just going to produce thorns and thistles. It's going to bring forth death in the sense that it's going to bring forth that which is not perfect anymore as God had originally created it. When God originally created it, he called it good. Now it's not good. What is it now? It's cursed. It now doesn't bring forth. So the smell of death is there everywhere. Everywhere, everything has been corrupted by death in some sense. We have, all of creation has, everything has been corrupted by the stench of death. It may not be death itself, but it's likened unto death because it comes out of a world that is dominated by death and corruption and evil and so forth in this world. And so that's this idea. It's a picture of a place that Bunyan is sending Christians through, or well, we all go through, Bunyan claims, that has this sense of death to it. Now, the natural question is, okay, what are the literal experiences that Bunyan's talking about here? Right? He's in his allegory, he's obviously making the point that there is a place that we're going to have to go through, and he's going to describe it in great detail as we go along. But as we go through these things, what is it? What are the kind of experiences that we're talking about here? Right? Basically, by using the phrase, by saying that it's a very solitary place, what Bunyan is implying is this is a place that you, as an individual, have to deal with in the course of life. Things you have to deal with as you are walking. Now, you may be going with others, but they're the kinds of things that are solitary in the sense that you have to deal with them in your life. And there's a number of things we could probably put into the category of what Bunyan's talking about. One of them would be, and probably the most obvious one that would come to mind, would be circumstances in which life is extraordinarily hard, painful, difficult. The loss of a family member in death. Cancer diagnosis. Something like that. The circumstances of life, the realities of living in this world and having to deal with something that comes up from this cursed world that we live in that causes us great struggle and strain and having to walk through this. And very often it's the kind of thing where you go through it alone. You go through it alone. When the doctor gives you the cancer diagnosis, other people can say, oh, I'm sorry that you have cancer, but you're the one that has to deal with it. You're the one that has to face the mortality issue. You're the one that has to look at that and say, okay, that's my life now, or that's my death now coming. The circumstances of the realities of living in this world as they crush in upon us and push us. The example that came to my mind is, I was thinking about the fact that Jesus himself even had to deal with these kinds of dark realities in his own life. He was not immune from these things. Question. This is a rhetorical question. What do you think Jesus was feeling during the several days that he waited before going to Lazarus' tomb? Right? He spent several days before he went, right? I mean, it was on the fourth day that they came and he said, roll back the stone. And he said, it's been 4 days, it'll be a stinketh. What do you think he was feeling in those times? Do you think he was going about his business as a happy-go-lucky? It's like, oh, my friend Lazarus died, so what? I'll just carry on with my ministry wherever he was. I suspect that Jesus was walking through a difficult time of grief, a time of mourning, and maybe a time of grief and mourning far greater than you and I can understand as the one who created the man in the first place and had established life upon the earth and looks at death as the great enemy that he's come to conquer. Life itself can be crushing and dark and difficult. And very often, we walk through it seemingly alone. Not only that, a second example would be those times in our lives when we have to deal with the realities of sin, temptation, and struggle, the consequences thereof. Now, I realize Bunyan's already painted a picture of that in the previous section, so in some sense he's not thinking of that here, but yet at the same time, we would have to admit, yes, there are times when we go through periods of great temptation and great struggle against evil from our own flesh, from those around us, etc., that crush in upon us and push us. And then there's other times, and this might be the one I think that Bunyan is probably most thinking of here. It's those times when you go through life and it just seems like there's no real joy in it. I liken it to the period of time between New Year's and spring, especially if you live in northern climes, okay? where it's cold and it's dark and it's gloomy and it seems to last forever. If I can quote Bill Murray from Groundhog's Day, it's bleak and it's cold and it's going to last for the rest of your life. That's how you feel, right? Now, it might be just circumstantial, but I'm suggesting to you what I'm talking about here that Bunyan may be thinking of is periods of spiritual dryness. Periods when it seems as though God is far away. That it's the reality of, my prayer life just seems like the prayers aren't even hitting the ceiling. I read the Word, it brings me no happiness, no joy. It doesn't bring me any solitude. I go to church and the worship feels stale and I just don't feel like I really want to be there. And the people they don't help me. I don't know what it is. It's walking through those spiritual deserts that Bunyan may be speaking of. Now, I say that because if you look at the previous chapter and you look at this one, you will notice just how graphic Bunyan gets here in both of these. The fight that we just saw with Apollyon was graphic. We saw the details, the fight, and how every little thing, and you're going to see the same thing here in this chapter. I think even more in this section. Bunyan is writing out of a time when he is in prison for preaching in a way inconsistently with the so-called authorities. And he's probably feeling a bit blue, sad, like, where's God when I need him? Why am I being persecuted for doing that which he commanded me to do? And now I'm not able to do. Now I'm trapped in a prison cell somewhere. It could very well be that Bunyan's writing this out of his clear experiences at the moment, where he's saying this is what the Christian life has in store for us. It's not all rose beds and wonderful places with Jesus. Sometimes it seems as though God is far away. And I think I'm convinced, especially as I get older, that these kinds of things come. We're not immune from them. There's no promises in the Scripture that once you come to Jesus, your life is all going to be wonderful. That's a lie that the devil would have you to believe, because then he can get you. Bunyan says, how about we face this head on and look at this reality? Yep, sometimes we're going to walk through places that are dark and difficult. And they're going to threaten to undo us. They're going to threaten to undo us. So this valley, Bunyan says, is a very solitary place. And then he says, the prophet Jeremiah thus describes it. All right? And he writes these words: a wilderness, a land of deserts and of pits, a land of drought and of the shadow of death, a land that no man but a Christian passeth through, and where no man dwelt. And he is, what you'll discover in a second, is that he is liberally quoting from Jeremiah 2. And I say liberally because it's interesting how he quotes the passage. In fact, let's look at Jeremiah 2. In Jeremiah 2, another of the prophetic utterances, probably the first great prophetic utterance of Jeremiah in the book, it says in the first verse of the chapter, the word of the Lord came to me saying, go and proclaim in the hearing of Jerusalem, thus saith the Lord. Okay, so he goes to speak to the people. And down in verse 5, it says, thus saith the Lord, what wrong did your fathers find in me, that they went far from me, and went after worthlessness, and became worthless? All right, so it's a rhetorical question that God is asking the people of Israel. Why did you think of me worthless and go chase worthless things? Verse 6. They did not say, where is the Lord who brought us up from the land of Egypt? who led us in the wilderness, in a land of deserts and pits, in a land of drought and deep darkness, in a land that none passes through, where no man dwells? Question mark. They didn't come to me and ask me, the God who brought you out of that place. Rather, they just ignored me. But you'll notice how Bunyan quotes the verse. And if you compare Jeremiah 2:6 to what he says, he takes a little liberty with the verse in order to try to make his point. He is saying here that this is a wilderness, a land of deserts and pits. What he doesn't say is the first part of that sentence, which is, where is the Lord who brought us up from the land of Egypt? Bunyan actually, it would have been good for him to have quoted that part of it, because Egypt is symbolic in Scripture for the place of enslavement and death. The people of Israel languishing in Egypt for 430 years are pictured to be in a place of enslavement and death. That's what Egypt is. To go to Egypt is to go to a place of enslavement and death. Somewhat ironical that the Son of God was taken by his parents to Egypt to get away from Herod. Fortunately, they came back. So Egypt is a place, it's pictured as a place. And I think Bunyan probably knows that. He's quoting just the second part of the verse to make his point. But then he describes it, this valley, as a wilderness, a land of deserts and of pits, a land of drought and of the shadow of death. That's all description of Egypt. That's all description of that place of enslavement. It was a place of droughts. It was a place of pits. It was a place of death and so forth, a land that we were in. But then he says, a land that no man but a Christian passeth through. So he changes Jeremiah's quote to say that the Christian himself is going to have to, in a sense, pass through his own Egypt. So he takes the verse and changes it, flips it over, if you will, in order to, instead of saying, in a land that none passes through where no man dwells, Bunyan changes it to a land that no man but a Christian passeth through, and where no man dwelt. So it's a place where men do not dwell, per se, symbolically speaking, but the Christian, Bunyan argues, will have to pass through this place. So Bunyan is arguing, by making the quote and changing the quotation, he is saying that, okay, the people of Israel looked at Egypt as, okay, that was our past. We don't want to go back there. We don't need to go back there. But Bunyan is taking it forward to us and saying, but you as believers, guess where you're going to have to go? You're going to have to go through your own Egypts at times in the course of your life. You're going to have to go and face these places of darkness and death and so forth. See it? So it's an interesting way that he puts it. It's an interesting way he spins Jeremiah 2:6 in order to make his point. And he then ends the paragraph by saying, now here Christian was worse put to it than with Apollyon. Meaning, this was going to be a harder struggle for Christian than facing Apollyon. I mean, if you think facing Apollyon was difficult, this will be far greater. Facing the evils out there in the world that come against us as we fight against them with the tools we've been given and the armor we've been given by God, that's one thing. But then there's this other thing, which is, in Bunyan's opinion, going to be even greater to traverse, harder to traverse. And that's these periods of drought and dryness, deserts, and pits, quagmires, and all kinds of other things. Symbolically represented, of course, in the allegory. All right? Be with me so far? Okay. Now the interlocutor reappears. He says, I saw then in my dream that when Christian was got to the borders of the shadow of death, there met him two men, children of them that brought up an evil report of the good land, making haste to go back. And he quotes from Numbers 13:32, and that is when the spies came back. You remember the 12 spies that were sent in, and 10 of them came back and said, we can't go in there. There's giants in there, and we're going to be destroyed, and so we just need to, and of course, Joshua and Caleb are like, what's your problem? God's got our back, let's go. But the 10 spies ultimately won over the people, and they then spent the next 40 years wandering around the wilderness because they wouldn't go in. Bunyan is using that verse here to apply to men who are coming back from somewhere. In other words, they're coming in the opposite direction that Christian is going. Christian is going forward, they're coming back. And they say, back, back. What they're saying is, Christian, you need to go back. You don't go forward. There's great trouble ahead. And Christian says, why? What is the matter? Matter, now notice that has an exclamation point. It really should have a question mark. It's like, matter? What do you mean? What's the matter? We were going that way as you are going. That's the two men are speaking here. We were going that way as you are going, and went as far as we durst, went as far as we thought we could. We looked before us and saw the valley, dark as pitch. It is dreadful, they answered. We also saw there the hobgoblins, how do you pronounce that? Satyrs or satyrs? Satyrs? Yeah. Satyrs and dragons of the pit. Okay. Creatures that are there, all the creatures that are mentioned here are typically in mythology representing evil. They're representing suffering and evil, okay? So there we saw the hobgoblins and the satyrs and the dragons of the pit. We also heard in that valley a continual howling and yelling as of a people in unutterable misery, who there sat bound in affliction and irons. What's that a picture of? It's probably a picture of Hades, or the place of the dead, those who cry out in that way. Now we'll see that more a little later on, so we have proof of that. And over that valley hangs the discouraging clouds of confusion. Now that helps to bolster my opinion of what it is that Bunyan is talking about, because very often, how do we feel in these moments of difficulty and trouble? We feel confused. Well, God, I thought you said, ... right? The clouds of confusion hanging over. Death also doth always spread his wings over it. It's like death is always there, always around the corner. In a word, it is every whit dreadful, being utterly without order. And Bunyan quotes here from Job chapter 3. You remember when we were in the book of Job not too long ago, I pointed out that Job's first response to the trouble that comes against him is to lament the fact that he was born. Remember? In fact, in Job chapter 3, verse 3, it says, "Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God not above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it that night. Let thick darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months." Translated simply, it would have been better if I'd have never been born. But notice what Bunyan is saying here. He's taking this picture from Job and he's placing it into this world and saying, this is what you're going to encounter in this place. These are what these men are running away from. It's a place where it's almost like it's better to not live than to go through it. In other words, there's great depth to this place of darkness and this droughts, the kinds of things that come against us from circumstances, the kind of things that come against us from sin, the kind of things that come against us from just spiritual dryness and drought that may enter into our lives either as a result of circumstances or not. In a word, it is dreadful. And in fact, he quotes again from Job in Job chapter 10, where Job goes back to lamenting his birth a little later on. You remember he does the same thing when he says in chapter 10, verse 1, "I loathe my life. I will give free utterance to my complaint. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul." And you go down to verse 22, he says, or down to verse 20, "Are not my days few? Then cease and leave me alone, that I may find a little cheer before I go. I shall not return to the land of darkness and deep shadow, the land of gloom, like thick darkness, like deep shadow without any order, where light is as thick as darkness." He's He's describing himself going down into death. I think by the time you get to 10, chapter 10, as we talked about in the book, you remember, Job's getting sick and tired of his friends blaming him for what's happening. And he says, it'd be better off if I was just dead. Now, I don't mean to be morbid, but is that not very often the response of people who struggle with great depression? I'd be better off dead. As though going down into death is actually going to be better than the circumstances that you're experiencing, which is a bizarre comparison, but that's what men do. That's the kind of place this is. This is a place that, if you'll pardon my way of saying it, this is a place that'll suck the life right out of you. This is a place where you wonder whether you'll get through it. Then said Christian, this is my way to the desired haven. I got to go this way. I got to go through here. And they said, be it thy way, we will not choose it for ours. So they parted. Now, what's the implication of these men who come? What are they saying? Well, they are men who Bunyan paints into the allegory, who represent those who go into these dark periods, who go into these difficulties, these kinds of gloomy periods of life, and abandon their faith. They turn around. They fail to continue to trust in the Lord and continue to follow along on the path. Or you might say it that they succumb to the realities of these dark places. They give up. Now, my own experience has been through the years as I've seen people go through various trials and troubles and go through gloomy periods. And I've met a lot of people who have experienced these kinds of things. My experience has been that very often those who do turn around, they do so slowly, and you don't really notice it. And they don't come right out and just say, well, I don't want to believe in Jesus anymore. They just don't push on beyond this. They just kind of stay put there. And they sort of live in that dreariness. And in a strange and twisted sort of way, I've even met people who actually get comfortable with living in the dreariness. It's like, that's my experience, and that's what I'm... So, they're the Eeyores of life who mope through life, and it seems some of the people that I've encountered in this, as I've attempted to counsel them with the scriptures, it's like, what is it that's keeping you from moving on? And it's sort of like a cat chasing its tail problem. It's like, well, I feel depressed, therefore I don't have the motivation to do what I need to do to push forward and so forth, and they kind of get stuck in a feedback loop. Or as we say in computer world, an infinite loop. They never get out of it. They get stuck in it. But these are men who are running away. I'm not going forward. I'm not going to go to the place that I'm going to go because I don't want to go through this. And I refer you back to a minute ago when they brought back an evil report of the good land. Now, I purposely skipped over that to leave it till now, because what they actually do is they actually now start talking bad about what it means to get to the celestial city. So they start saying, it's not as good as you think it is. You Christians have made up this idea that we're going to a better place and it's all great, but you know what? My experience says that's not the case. Of course, our response should be, look, your experience doesn't count, okay? Because we don't base our faith on your experience. But isn't it true, though, that so many do base their beliefs on their experiences? This is going back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of this. This is one of the side effects of this modern fascination with happiness, It isn't about truth that determines the path of life. It's about experience that produces the path of life. And the decisions I make are based on my experiences. And then you will have others come and say, well, but my experiences trump your truths. My experience is not that. Therefore, you have to accept my position based on my experience. I would argue that's the reason why so many faithful pastors who have thrown over their good theology and embraced evil, like homosexuality, for example, or transgenderism, do so because they've had an experience of some sort with that. Someone they know that has become homosexual, and so they're like, well, my experience trumps that. No, it doesn't. That's the point. Bunyan says, the experience itself is the experience. The reality lives beyond the experience. This valley is indeed a valley that we must walk through, and there will be struggles as we walk through it, and we will have to face deep and dark gloom of grief and terror, fear, and hopelessness, and dryness, and drought, and all these other kinds of things that will come against us. But they are not definitive of what life is. We make the mistake of thinking they are. We make the mistake of thinking that they are. So Bunyan, I think Bunyan paints these two men in order to contrast them with Christian, because what does Christian decide to do? Well, that's my way to the desired haven. I got to go this way. I got to pass through this valley of the shadow of death, whether I like it or not. But I will go with a particular thought in mind. So Christian went on his way, but still with his sword drawn in his hand for fear lest he should be assaulted. So he's still carrying his sword. He still has the word out and ready to deal with anything that would come against him along the way. Now, what you're going to discover here is that the sword, now, don't misunderstand what I'm about to say, okay? Because I'm about to say something that's going to make you go, heretic. We wield the scriptures against the problems of life. But sometimes it seems as though the scriptures are not enough. Now I'm not suggesting they're not, okay? But the point is that sometimes in these periods of drought, we may wield the sword, but it really doesn't bring us out of the trouble that we're in. Person who is mourning a loss, for example, a deep loss. And they're mourning deeply, they're deeply in pain, and they go to the Word, and the Word doesn't seem to bring them any consolation in the midst of it. Now again, I'm not suggesting the Bible can't bring consolation. It obviously will. We believe it is the foundation of consolation. But the bottom line is that sometimes we may find ourselves, the whole point of this experience being that even our meditation upon the Word seems to come up short in our lives. Seems to come up as though it doesn't really help me. Now, I'm convinced, okay, I'll get you in a second, Don, because I do want to clarify here. I want to make sure that you understand. I'm not saying that the Bible is not the tool by which we pass through these things. But the fact is that the point of a drought, a spiritual dryness at times, does imply, does it not, that sometimes we'll find ourselves not really finding the answers we're looking for in the scriptures. But Christian keeps the sword in his hand nonetheless, doesn't he? Because in the end, what he's going to confess is going to be a testimony from the word he's carrying. All right, so Bunyan doesn't want to paint this naive picture that every answer to every problem is just going to pop off the page of Scripture. All you got to do is open your Bible randomly to some place and ta-da, you're going to find the answer. That's not necessarily going to be the case. Sometimes you're going to walk through spiritual deserts and darknesses where you're going to say, I don't see how the Word helps me. But the bottom line is that Bunyan presses on, and with his Bible in hand, pictured in the sword, he does ultimately come to the answer from the scriptures. Okay? Don?
Can I just give an example of the point you're making?
Sure.
In the Gospels, Jesus wasn't just tempted at the end of those three temptations. He was tempted by Lucifer for 40 days.
Correct.
And we can assume, safely, that he addressed each of those temptations like he did the last ones by employing the word.
The word, correct.
But it went on for 40 days.
It went on for 40 days, that's right.
So he was using the word.
That's right. He had the word there, and it continued on for a while. Now, I would say that I would caution the use of the illustration because you're talking about the Son of God wielding the scriptures compared to me wielding the scriptures, okay? I'm not going to make that comparison, all right? But I think you're right in the point being that as Jesus struggled through the 40 days, he had to wield the scriptures, but he had to go through the 40 days. And let me suggest, I mean, it's just not even the 40 days, more than the 40 days. His entire life was probably Lucifer following him around behind him and tapping him on the shoulder in multiple different ways. That was one of the most expressive times of temptation, but there were probably many others. So thank you for the illustration. The thorn in the flesh of Paul, right? Prayed for it again and again, and God said, nope, I'm going to leave it. My grace is sufficient for you. Even though he prayed for it to go away. So there's probably many examples in Scripture that we could bring here to exemplify what's being talked about, okay? But Christian is carrying his sword, but he's still going to go into a place where the sword, in a sense, is ineffective against the darkness. I mean, you swing a sword in dark, it doesn't change the darkness, right? It's not a tangible thing. All right, so not to press the allegory too far, but the point is I think that Bunyan's trying to say you're going to walk into this sometimes and it's going to be a lot harder than you think. So he describes then in this paragraph, he says, the pathway was exceeding narrow with a very deep ditch on the right hand and a dangerous quagmire on the left. So a miry pit of some sort to fall into. A quagmire is a pit of mire, a place you could fall in and drown or sink, or it's like quicksand, you might think, okay? So a quagmire on one side. He sighed bitterly. That ditch on the right is it into which the blind have led the blind in all ages. The blind leading the blind. The blind dig a ditch and then fall into it themselves, right? So it's that side of the road in which those who think they know can help you through it, and they wind up helping you into the ditch. And that quagmire on the left, even if a good man falls, he can find no bottom of his foot to stand on. Into that quagmire King David once did fall, and had no doubt therein been smothered, had not he that is able plucked him out. And he makes a reference to Psalm 69 here, which is an interesting picture. Oops, other direction. Psalm 69:14. How many Psalms are in this thing? All right. Psalm 69, verse 14. David writes this, doesn't really say when, but the first verse says, save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire where there's no foothold. I have come into deep waters, and the flood sweeps over me. And then in verse 4, he says, more in number than the hairs of my head are those who hate me without cause, mighty are those who would destroy me. So he writes this apparently during some particular time when he's being attacked. Maybe he writes it during the time that he's running from Saul, or maybe he writes it later when he's being attacked by enemies on all sides. But then he says in verse 14, deliver me. Well, go to 13. But as for me, my prayer is to you, O Lord, at an acceptable time, O God, in the abundance of your steadfast love, answer me in your saving faithfulness. And here's my prayer. Deliver me from sinking in the mire. Let me be delivered from my enemies and from the deep waters. And let not the flood sweep over me, or the deep swallow me up, or the pit close its mouth over me. So Bunyan's saying this is the kind of thing that David experienced in the course of his life when he was surrounded by enemies and he was in the midst of his difficulties. whichever one that might be. He felt as though he was sinking into a pit, into a quagmire that was going to suck him down and take him. And that's the kind of picture that Bunyan is painting of these times that we will have to go through. It's like we're slogging through quicksand and we can't seem to make progress. We can't seem to get out of it. We're trapped in this quagmire of difficulty and trouble and pain and darkness and mourning and etc. Just like King David did. In other words, what Bunyan, I think, is saying here in a very simplest sense is, okay, this is a situation common to man. David experienced it. We'll experience it. It's a part of walking upon this earth. This is where it goes. So what we have done in the first few paragraphs of this section is we've set the stage here for this place. Now we know what it is. We know what it's named. We know what it represents. We've even seen some men who go into it and come out because they don't want to pass through it. They don't have the fortitude to continue on through it, to face the realities of it. So we've set the stage then for Christian coming to this place. And then we'll see in the weeks ahead, Lord willing, the actual traveling through it and how Bunyan paints Christian getting through this time of life. You could, in a sense, it's almost as though Bunyan is cathartic in this, writing about it in such a way that I'm experiencing this myself, but here's what we need to do. Here's what I need to do. And all my fellow preachers that are stuck in this prison with me, we need to carry on in the midst of this darkness and walk this path that we're set upon and not turn back. Okay? Correct.
Because you know the scriptures when you're going through those
Yeah.
times. You know the scripture, you know the truth.
The feeling is gone. We know things to be true, but the feeling disappears. Well, isn't that ironical that the church has spent the last 100 years trying to convince you that all that matters is feelings? Well, no. What we know is what matters. Okay. Correct. That's correct. What you know and what you feel are two different things. And so now we know what this looks like. And, going along with that, to add one final thought to that, and that is that you often hear people say knowledge is power. What you know going into something is what allows you to get through that. Since I know what I'm going to face here, I should therefore be prepared for it. Or to say it as a preacher would say it, the troubles that you will experience in the future, you prepare for now. If you're not going through such a quagmire, you will. And so prepare yourself now for that day when it comes. In other words, don't get caught in this situation without having been prepared for it. Well, that's what Bunyan's trying to do, really. He's trying to prepare us to say, this is what the Christian life is going to have. Don't be naive, but here's how you're to walk through it.